Welcome to MCC Press. Today we'll talk about David Engels' book named Tegyünk, recently released by MCC Press in Hungary. Mr. Engels is a professor of Roman history at the Free University of Brussels and a research fellow at Poznan. The book itself talks about the impending, if not already happening, decline of European civilization and how can we live with it and maybe even revolt against it. Without further ado, let's begin. Welcome to Budapest, Mr. Engels.
Okay, fine. Thank you all very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here to speak about the Hungarian translation of my book, What is to be Done, and of course we will speak quite a lot about the content. So I will just give a very general introduction to this topic, which may seem at first view quite depressing, what is to be done, living with the decline of Europe, and speak a bit about the origin of that book. Well, I don't have to go into the details, I think, of the diagnosis of a deep crisis of our European Western civilization. We all know that there are quite a lot of issues, be it now mass migration, be it terrorism, the decline of Christianity, the danger of Islam, the danger of China, inner social polarization, economic domination by small oligarchies, and so forth and so forth. We know, of course, for many years that all this is happening, and unfortunately also this evolution of a steady cultural, social, political, economic decline of our Western civilization is not something that happened just for the last few years, but something that is inscribed deeply into at least the last 3 or 4 generations of our Western evolution. If we look at many of the statistics going back to the First World War or the Second World War, we see that many of these issues we are suffering now from today go back very far into the past. And that shows, of course, also that it will be quite difficult to change the direction or change the course of history. As I personally am deeply convinced, exactly as Oswald Spengler, one of my, I would say, major intellectual influencers, that we can draw something like a parallel history of all major civilizations, and that all civilizations know their phase of ascendancy, but also of decline. And very obviously, our Western civilization arrived now at a stage of decline, of old age, so to speak, quite similar to what happened in classical antiquity during the late Roman Republic, as I tried also to sketch in one of my books, also translated into Hungarian. And somehow we have to live with that feeling of being parts of a civilization that is in decline, that is rapidly approaching its final state of existence, and somehow we have to deal with it. That is, on the one hand, the outer condition that led me to writing this very personal book. The other condition is, of course, also my origin as a Belgian citizen living in a smaller town of eastern Belgium, in Verviers, which is a town already very strongly hit by unemployment, by economic decline, by mass migration, also by socialist indoctrination and so forth, and living for many, many years in such a framework also shows, of course, suggests also the fact that it will be very difficult, or even impossible somehow, to change the course of things. I also worked for many years at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, which is, I would say, a typically very strongly leftist liberal universities, very strongly leaning to a more politically correct side also of things. And working there also showed me to what extent large parts of the political elites, at least of Western Europe, are already dominated by this more wokish thought, and that there is not much to hope also from these elites. And so it seems obvious that during the next decades there is not much that can happen, at least in Western Europe, to deflect the decline of the West or to change its trajectory. So we have to deal somehow with it. And so that poses, of course, the question, what is to be done? And this is a question, of course, people are asking for quite many years. And I thought also it could be a good idea, in order to respond to that question, to go back to some of the major texts bearing their title, like Chernyshevsky's Что делать, or like Lenin's What is to be done, but in order to show that the situation have changed radically. In the 19th century, it were the socialists who somehow lived in some forms of catacombs, and they were banished and outed by a still quite conservative traditional society, whereas today the situation has changed radically. Now, at least in Western Europe, it is essentially people from a more conservative background who now seem to live in some form of parallel societies, who are not welcome anymore by their family, by their working place, by the political establishment, and they suffer more and more from many diverse forms of political repression, and so also have to organize somehow their own life, have to organize not only their political movements but also their personal lives in order to stay still somehow honest to their ideals and to live them in their general life, which is why I took that book also in order to provoke, of course, leftist readers, in order to show that we can also take over some of their ideas, or at least some of their book titles, in order to somehow to steer a debate and go into the offensive. So the book I wrote is a very personal book, because I suffered for many years from the situation I sketched there, be it on the professional side, be it on the general ambience, atmosphere of decline. And I asked myself every day, what can I do in this situation in order to remain true to my ideals, to somehow live them in everyday life, to give them over also to my children, and to fulfill my duty. Because I'm fundamentally convinced that even though it is impossible to hope into a true renewal of European civilization, like a new spiritual awakening like in the Middle Ages, or new renaissance of our artistic history as in the 15th or 16th century, that this possibility is finished. The West is bound to decline, as all other civilizations had to. But this does not somehow take away the necessity of us as last Westerners, you could say, to remain true to our ideals and to still pass over to our children, to the next generations, the true identity, the true spirit of the West for as long as possible. The ancients did that, the Greeks and the Romans managed throughout the entire history also of the empire to cling to many of their traditions, and enabled finally many of the knowledge, or much of the knowledge of antiquity, to be passed over to the arising Western civilization, and to help it under the Carolingians and Teutonians to once again build a new civilization. And so it might be perhaps our duty also to pose the foundations not only for some phase of stabilization of the declining Western civilization as under the empire, but also to canonize somehow our knowledge in order to pass it on for as many centuries as possible, so that perhaps later generations, later civilizations may go back to it. We have anyway to distance ourselves from the very utilitarian perspective that an aim that cannot be fulfilled somehow is useless. To the contrary, I would say that it is a deep part even of our Christian Western identity to know that even a battle that is very obviously to be lost on a material point of view can still be won on a higher transcendent level. And so even if we know that the West as itself cannot be anymore live through a new phase of renewal, it is still our duty to protect it as long as possible, to defend it, even though, and perhaps precisely because we know that that battle can never finally be won, because finally true success cannot be achieved anyway in this world as we know it as a Christian. What happens is the battle, what happens is the fight, what happens is to remain true to our ideals and to create, of course, also islands of continuing existence, island also of patriotism, of Western patriotism, like here, for example, in Hungary or in Poland, and to fight back the general evolution. And this book, and we will certainly go into some of these details, is thus organized into a series of chapters which try to be not political or not overmuch political, but rather to focus on everyday issues. So we have chapters on being realistic about the decline of our civilization, on turning away from the state and going back to parallel institutions, building a new civil society, at least among people who are conservative patriots and who really love their own civilization, leaving the big cities, at least in Western Europe, where these cities can really become a mortal trap for many people, investing responsibly with our money, buying European produces, precisely or especially of people we know, overcoming short-term thinking and thinking again in generations, perhaps even in centuries when we are planning our endeavors, sharing in nature, going back to somehow also to respect for nature, surrounding oneself with beauty, that also a very important point in the middle of this more and more grotesque environment. Not confusing gender equality with gender identity, founding a family, educating one's children, doing one's duty, regardless for the outcome, being tolerant but not being suicidal, weighing our words, the words we use, so that we are sure to use our own words, our own terminology, and not the left's one, and thus impose on ourselves already an ideology which is not our ideology. Believing, once again, meditating also regularly, reading but not arbitrarily, taking care also of our body, but not in an hedonist, materialist fashion, but rather in a responsible way, overcoming the apparent divisions between right and left, renouncing obedience to many forms of authority, reconquering Europe, of course, choosing our own battlefield and investing our energies where they are most useful, and finally being proud also of our own European history. These are the 24 chapters that give some hints, some general ideas on how we can be and remain European, Westerner in our everyday life, and I hope that book can help some people. Now, of course, I know that the French environment, the German environment, the Polish or the Hungarian environment are all quite different one from the other when it comes to be a patriot and to know how to place our own, or how to safeguard our own identity. But still, I think there might be something for everyone in there. And perhaps in Central European countries, it can also be quite interesting to see to what extent this decline of Western identity has already come, so that it has become necessary even to write such books, which are in some way a symptom even of a crisis which has not yet reached as much as in the West, the societies of Central Europe. So this is broadly the outlook on the content of that book, and now I'm really happy to have some questions and to discuss with you about these different issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the intriguing introduction. Well, this is going to be a low-hanging fruit, but I want to get it out of the way. Has anything changed with the incoming pandemic?
No, certainly not. To the contrary, everything is worse now than when I wrote the book. This book has, of course, a long history in itself. I started to write it in 2014, immediately after my book on the parallels between the current crisis of Europe and the end of the Roman Republic, not the Roman Empire, the Republic. Took me quite a couple of months also, perhaps even years, to write it slowly. And then it was not easy to publish it in the first place, as many publishers said to me, no, we only want to publish books that are critical, that are negative, that are provocative, but we do not want to sell books which give a positive message or want to construct things, because that wouldn't sell really. That's what was told by many French editors. But in the end, after some years, I thought it was, thus I put put this manuscript aside for a couple of years. And then in the end, I thought that in 2019, it was really necessary once again to go back to that manuscript, to change it a little bit, but not much, and to publish it. And it seems to me that it's, it touched a very sensible chord for many people, especially in German, where this book has been some form of bestseller, which I never really expected. Now we will even have an audiobook that will come out during the next week, where I read the book myself. So it's functioning quite well, and I don't think that its content somehow depends very much on political event. I think we are still more or less on the same situation. I would rather see that the big difference is probably one between a Western European readership and a more Central or Southeastern European readership, because the social and cultural conditions in both halves of Europe are quite different. And many of the pessimist outlooks I try to share in that book do not yet apply that much to the condition in Poland or Hungary, for example, as they do in a French environment.
But is it actually possible for the Central and Eastern European countries to shift the tide and to carry the torch forwards to the Western countries?
No, we cannot change the tide. The West will end. All civilizations end one way or the other, so we won't escape this. But as a declining and an ending or dying civilization doesn't mean that everything will crumble and we will all be killed and there will be some form of storm on all Western cities, and then the end there will just be ruins. They're a very romantic vision of the end of civilizations, which doesn't correspond at all to factual reality. What is ending is for the moment the wish of large parts of the people to be part of our civilization. More and more people distance themselves from their part. They do not want that heritage. They reject it. They become, of their own wish, and of course imposed upon also by the media, by school, by politics, post-historical beings. They live in these cities, they work, they learn writing, they make things, but they are not anymore parts of a collective cultural identity. And more people simply drop out of this civilizational grip, which means that in the end there will just be some handfuls of people who still try to cling to their own identity, exactly as in late antiquity there were just some last noble families in Rome who still clung to traditional paganism and tried to keep it up and still to copy classical Roman and Greek authors in order to pass on that knowledge. And something very similar will happen to us. And of course, once a civilization becomes devoid of people identifying themselves with this civilization, then this civilization is bound to crumble more and more, because nobody feels really responsible for it. Nobody is wanting anymore to sacrifice himself for this civilization. People want to use it and to make it more or less work without too much effort, but they are not willing to die for it. And that is the end of a civilization, when such a process happens. And for the moment, this process is obvious, essentially, in Western Europe, of course, and it is not just a question of mass migration or population replacement. That is, of course, also another issue for Western Europe, but it's not a key issue. I would say it is rather a symptom of some form of self-hate, of some form of self-distanciation with our own past. And once someone is not anymore linked to his past, once he has rejected that heritage, as many of my students have already rejected that heritage, then it becomes extremely difficult for them to tie in again. I made that effort for many years in my university to try to show to my students that this is their heritage, that it belongs to them, it is their identity, and they have the duty, I would even say the sacred duty, to place themselves in the continuity of what their fathers and forefathers left to them. But it is very difficult to tie people into that once they have lost this connection. It can be done, but it will always remain a very small minority.
So you say this alienation is irreversible, so there's nothing we can do to regain our people?
Yes.
Okay. Well, heading towards our next point, you mentioned that it's crucial to move away from larger cities. Is it actually feasible for the ordinary man to move away, especially when their economical status won't allow them to do so?
Well, of course, it depends from one country to the other. I mean, currently I'm living in Warsaw, which is not really a small city, and the conditions are of course very different. So the appeal to move away from these mega cities is essentially targeting the living conditions of France, essentially. The book has been written first in French, so its main audience was and still is a French audience, and it's obvious for everyone who has visited Paris and who moved a little bit beyond just seeing Notre Dame, the Louvre, and the Opera, that this is a city that is lost somehow. It is a city that becomes very quickly a death trap when there is unrest, when there's an economic crisis, when there is perhaps also an energetic crisis. These cities are literally dangerous for people to live in there, and essentially, of course, for conservative people. It is an unhealthy environment that can become very dangerous very quickly, and so my advice would be, of course, for people who want to rear children, not to stay in there, rather to go to a small town, rather to go to the countryside, and somehow choose an environment that is healthy and where some conservative can still create some form of parallel society or new society that can bring some of these communities again to a situation of cultural majority where they can really change things. Some conservatives in a city of 10 or 20 million people like Paris, this is like a little drop of vinegar in 20 liters of water. Doesn't change really much. To the contrary, it is not very efficient also from a political point of view. But at least on the countryside, this can change, perhaps certainly, and it is the most intelligent thing to do, because we are moving towards a period of economic decline, very obviously, of political unrest that will accompany it. We will have big problems also with supply chains, with even the basic need of our civilized survival. And so any possibility to get out of that, as long as there is still time, and to go into a more healthier environment, is something that I personally would advise to many people. Now, of course, there might be also people who feel in themselves the mission to form some islands of cultural resistance within big cities, and who say no, we need to remain there, at least in order to save some positions, to speak to the people. Of course, that's a personal option that can also be very welcome. But I would say, in general, going away from these big cities, going rather into a natural environment where you can have your garden, where you can partly even grow your own things, where you can have some animals, have children play outside, or so. That's, I would say, the most logical, the most healthy thing to do if you are a conservative living in Western Europe. In the East or Central Europe, of course, the conditions are very different, and I wouldn't advise anyone to now absolutely move away from Warsaw, because there would be some form of mortal danger. That would be, of course, preposterous. But in the West, it is more and more becoming like that.
But by creating this parallel society, won't we alienate those even more who stay behind, who don't have the courage to do so?
Could you repeat, please?
So won't we alienate those people who stay behind even more by moving away?
Yes, of course, but I mean, it's a choice everyone has to do. So I wouldn't say that someone who doesn't respect one point of my book would be to be condemned. I'd just say that this is the sensible thing to do when you have your children. Of course, if you want to play the martyr or be an example or show that you can even have children in the middle of an ultra-violent Islamist banlieue in Paris, okay, to do so can be even admirable to try it, but I wouldn't want to do it for myself. So I think the most intelligent thing to do, if you are living currently in cities such as Paris or Marseille or Lyon, is to move away as soon as possible. As we see already what happened also in New York, where more and more people are leaving New York because these cities become simply dangerous. They are uncontrollable. In one case of crisis, everything can explode. There won't be any form of security anymore. So if you have some parental responsibilities, I think the most sensible thing to do would be to first bring your family into a zone where you can be sure to assure their upbringing and their healthy education, and then perhaps see later what you want to do for yourself.
Touching upon the topic of accommodation, you mentioned in your book the importance of long-term planning. Is it actually possible for us to own our own houses when nowadays apartments and houses are constructed on the sole purpose of being rented out and being lended? How can we turn the tide on this one?
It's a personal choice to what degree you want to remain within a certain system. I mean, I know all the arguments that people say all the day. I can't change my life because I have a mortgage. I will lose my job. I will lose my friends, my family connection. Of course, many people are a little bit like Gulliver, who is tied by many tiny little ropes, and not one of these ropes is specifically important, but all in their mass make it so that someone who is a giant may be tied to the earth. But I think it's a question of organizing your life, of taking risks. I think you have to assess to what degree you are willing to participate in a certain game, and to sacrifice some of your ideals to remain within, and to what degree you are willing to say, no, I have to go out of that and I will sacrifice everything for that. I mean, for the entirety of history, many people have simply dropped out. I mean, if you think about the early Christians, they were ready to die for their faith. They didn't think about, I will lose my job, I will lose my house, it's so easy, I will just have to sacrifice a little bit of frankincense for the emperor, and then everyone is happy with me. They didn't want it. They were ready to die for that. And during the religious wars in the 16th, 17th century, also people were ready to die for their belief. They didn't want to make compromises. So it is possible, but you need, of course, to see to what degree you are able and willing to take certain risk, and to what degree it is your responsibility to remain within. That's why I named one of the chapters of my book also choosing your battlefield. I mean, everyone cannot do the same thing. For some people, it may be important to remain within their job because they have some influence, so they may perhaps have to hide some of their conservative views because they know it is for better good to remain within. Others have perhaps more liberal professions where they can permit themselves to construct their own things. Some people have children, others have not. I mean, everyone has to choose, of course, how his means can be invested best for this common fight, and that cannot be predicted or imposed on anyone. But as I say, it's a personal choice, and I think it is always possible to escape it if you are willing to take the risks.
Talking about battlefields, is it actually possible for us in the East and Central Europe to help Western civilization? I mean, to help with Western problems, to somehow stall this decline, or just slow it down a little bit?
Yes, certainly. I mean, in my book on the path towards empire, I try to show that the parallels with the late Roman Republic, but also with nearly all other big human civilizations, show us that there are two things that seem unavoidable on ground of that parallel. First is that we will probably have to face one generation, 20 years of strong civil unrest. We are already starting that now. You see inflation is already coming. You see that the Yellow Vest, Black Lives Matter, Corona manifestations, all of that is, of course, already a symptom and is a premonitory sign of this civil unrest that will probably lead the West really to the brink of disaster. That's what happened also in the late Roman Republic. That's what happened in all other human civilizations. And then there will be some phase of reconstruction, you could say, of construction of some form of final civilizational state, like the Roman Empire, like the Han Empire in China, like the Empire of Khosroes in Iran, like the Ramessid Empire in Egypt, like the Fatimid Empire in the classical Muslim world. And that is something also towards which we are heading. And so I would say that, yes, Eastern Europe has a certain mission. Very obviously, it has the mission to show, on the one hand, to the West that a normal, moderately conservative society is still possible. That it doesn't mean that we are that a patriot must be a fascist doing genocide everywhere and starting world wars and killing people and so. But to the contrary, that countries such as Poland or Hungary are perfectly normal, well-run conservative countries where much of the normalcy which has left the West is still conserved. So I think that is an important message, to stay apart from the self-destruction of the West as much as possible and to mirror some alternative form of moderately conservative existence, and of course also to help the West through initiatives like the MCC, very obviously, which tries to help people also from Western Europe, to bring them here, to give them some form of safe haven where they can learn, where they can study, where they can build networks, and where they can tie together again conservatives from all over Europe. I think that is one of the missions of Central Europe. And once this self-destruction of the West, which is also happening here, but in a somewhat lesser degree, once that is over, it can be hoped for, of course, that the impetus and some help also for the reconstruction of the West can be done also with the help here of Central Europe, and thanks to its inspiration. So there is obviously a very big mission for the eastern half, you could say, of Europe, for its western half. Yes.
So touching upon education, what about the younger generation who are dependent on their parents, for example? They can't just move away. And when everything is so intertwined, is it actually possible for them to stay away?
Well, it depends. I mean, you have always the choice as a parent where you send your schools and how you organize their upbringing. You can, of course, just delegate everything to a school and send them in the middle of a problem zone school to a very leftist, multiculturalist school, and then see what happens. Or you can try to invest your children. You can try to choose good schools. You can perhaps even try to school them yourself if it's legally possible, which is not the case everywhere, as I know. But for example, in Poland we have homeschooling. In France there is, or was at least until last year, also possibility of homeschooling. You can always also inscribe your children in some forms of more traditionalist educating outside of schools. You can try to help them, to show them things, to make grow in them the love for their own civilization, and showing them the great buildings of our civilization, to show them the music we did right, to accustom them also to some of the basic ideas of our philosophy. So all that is in the hand of parents, but you need, of course, to invest it. You need to take the time. You need to. I just had some talks about that with some of you before the beginning of this event. To sacrifice some of your own self-realization for your children. To invest this time, and you can change enormously their evolution. And if you see that things do not happen as it is, you can always move and go into another country. That's what I did. I moved expressly on purpose from Belgium to Poland, essentially because of my children, in order to be sure that they would grow up in Poland in an environment that was much more healthy for children, that was much more normal, where schools were not about leftist indoctrination, where you could say the social fabric of society is not yet that polarized as it is the case, for example, in Belgium, and to be in an environment also where things like criminality and so forth is really more or less non-existent, which is also very different from many of the schools and cities in Belgium. So it is possible, it can be done, but you have to sacrifice sometimes some things and think in long dimensions and think about next generations instead of next year.
So we are rapidly approaching the 10-minute mark, so if any of you in the audience have any sort of question, feel free to ask. Moving on, I think it's best if I take now a lighthearted question while everyone in the audience thinks about asking something. In your book, you mentioned the importance of reading good literature. Is there any kind of book you could recommend to the audience?
Good literature, well, I mean, good literature is very subjective. It's not about that you need to read books that are in a certain canon and not the rest. That's not the aim of the chapter, but rather to approach another understanding of reading. And reading is not or must not necessarily be about just consuming every new important novel that has just been gone out in order to discuss about other people what you think about it. Reading that can be sometimes concentrating many efforts just on one book, and many books can develop and can grow within your own life. For example, in my case, one of the authors which I would never have, or who I would never have thought would influence me so much when I first read him was Tolkien. I mean, I discovered Tolkien when I was 14 or 15 and really liked it and read a lot about him. But I would never have thought that even now, with 42 years of age, I would go back to Tolkien and his Middle-earth nearly every day in my life, because it has become so important. And not because I would say Tolkien is more important than Virgil or the Ancient Testament or Goethe or whatever. It's just that sometimes you can grow through a certain book, you can read it again and again, and it's more about reading things not in order to consume them, but rather in helping them, elevating you and giving some elements in you that grow over time and that make you another person. I think that is very important, even more so in a world where today we are so addicted to just consuming things on our smartphone, and where we already see that the text longer than perhaps 5,000 signs is already too long to be read on that kind of device. And I think we have to go back and take the time to go back to real literature and to the real act of reading, and to opening ourselves to that form of experience that is slowly declining also over the ages.
So do we have any sort of questions in the audience?
I would like to ask about the cities. You mentioned, and Christian also asked, the issue of the cities and the rural-urban cleavage. How do you see the changes of the role of the cities in European culture? And do you see any deeper differences between Western and Eastern cities and their role in the local society?
Yeah, that's of course a vast question. I'm not an expert on the urban question or urbanization or that kind of thing. But at least what is becoming obvious in France, for example, is that the country itself is more and more depleted of its energy, of its people, of its productive power by one mega city, which is Paris. And you can say more or less the same about London when it comes to England on a somewhat other base. And I think that is an evolution that goes further and further. We see in the US, we also see this enormous concentration of population in certain centers, and in between there's nothing that is left anymore. And that too is unavoidable as evolution. We see it in all big civilizations. We see it at the end of the Roman Republic, where some mega cities grow to enormous proportions, like Rome, like Antioch, Alexandria, Carthage, and so forth. And entire countries like Italy become a desert. Italy, the late Roman Republic. That's what is happening once again right now. But it is, of course, something very dangerous, because these cities, they become a world in itself, but they are also extremely fragile. They can be very open any form of aggression, of economic decline, of political unrest, and that is the time we are heading for. We are heading for a time of major political unrest, and this unrest will touch essentially the cities. Of course, that's where history will be written, but it will not be written really by large masses, because people are depoliticized. These are big cities who can fall from one second to the other to a handful of armed men, for example, because these people are not politicized anymore. They do not have any political instinct. They are perhaps able to do some riots and so forth, but it will not be like the political disputes of the 19th century with its revolutions. But nevertheless, these cities can and will fall prone to many forms of aggression, of criminality, of starvation also potentially, and so I wouldn't want to live or to have to grow to raise my children somewhere in a Paris suburb. Personally, I think that would be extremely irresponsible and a dangerous thing to do. Of course, if people are ready to do it, to sacrifice, and if that's plan of how they see life, that's good. But I think that being in contact with nature, with some free air, with a minimum of garden, with the possibility to plant some things yourself, to have some animals, to show this reality to children, that is something that is eminently conservative, and that is part, I think, of our duty also as conservative parents, to make our children participate in that, and not to have them grow up in this increasingly technicized, transhumanist, artificial environment that is deadly, that is part of this culture of death. And we need also to go back to a real culture of life and nature and open space, and living things are part of that. So this is something that children should at least for some years partake in order to know how it functions.
So a question from the audience: can you say something about the failures of the church that led to the lapsing of Christian civilization?
About the?
Lapsing from the church, so the failures of the church. For example, faults, mistakes, anything?
I'm sorry.
Mistakes from the church, for example, from the Catholic Church, that led to the lapsing of civilization.
The mission of the church?
No, lapsing like mistakes.
Mistakes?
From the church, like mistakes caused by the church.
Mistakes by the church? The current mistakes of the Catholic Church, you mean?
Yeah, for example.
Yeah, of course, the most of our Christian churches, be it the Catholics, be it the Protestants, are also part of the current decline of civilization. We see that it's sometimes very difficult to speak to mostly young people, of course, and trying to explain to them that becoming Christian, or at least developing some form of positive relationship to their Christian heritage, is part of their duty and is part of what it means to be a European. And when I say that to young people, conservative people, they say, aha, so the Christian church, so that means people like Cardinal Marx in Germany, who is a very well-known leftist cardinal with very strange views on the future of the church and of priesthood. So obviously the church is starting to be also a part of the problem, and the church itself is divided exactly as our society is divided into a dominant mainstream organization on the one hand that works hand in hand, of course, with the large media and political establishment, and then, unfortunately, a small minority that tries to hold up some form of traditionalism. And if we look at the French church, we see the very interesting evolution that the more leftist mainstream church is obviously dying. People do not go to masses anymore. They go perhaps for Christmas mass and so forth. But essentially, they have the support of the media. But there are no people who believe anymore. Of course, the many church representatives are present when it comes to represent some form of we could say public opinion in larger events. But there are no faithful anymore. And on the other hand, in France, we see that new priests are coming essentially from very traditionalist, a very conservative background, and that for the moment it's the traditionalist groups who are slowly replacing part by part the church. And so very probably in one generation we will have a situation where, at least in Western Europe, Christianity will have radically disappeared, but where it is still existing, then it will be more and more dominated rather by traditional and conservative forces, which is perhaps not a bad thing. So that is, I think, the direction that the church will take, and I hope that once this ideological shift from a leftist mainstream church working with the media to a more conservative church, which is much smaller, but which is dominated by young people who are patriots and who really want to believe and to continue this tradition, that then, of course, this will infuse also our plans for conservative renewal of Europe, also with another and a new transcendent spirit.
So I think this is going to be the last question, and I think we can end on this note. Do you think there will be a so-called conservative renaissance in the West as a sort of reaction for the descendants of European civilization?
There was also a question about the I think. Yeah, I
had the same question. Oh, sorry, sorry about this. Excuse me. So I think let's end on this one. We can see Russia represented.
No, but I think I still have to answer to your question. I think I just wanted to say that Gladden had a question that we shouldn't forget him. But so the question is about: will there be? Is there a possibility of a conservative renewal of Europe? Yeah, that's your question.
Yes, so-called Renaissance. Yeah.
Yeah. No, we won't have any. But as I said, in comparison to the other civilizations, I firmly believe that at the end of this phase of unrest, we will have a conservative stabilization of Europe. It will not be a renaissance. It will not be a new cycle. But it will be at least some form of organizing what is left of our civilization on more or less conservative grounds. We may not be happy with it, because if you look at the Augustan Principate, the Augustan restitution of traditional religion, of republican institutions, of some form of traditional morality, all this is good and nice, but it is very artificial. What Augustus tried to impose. And people didn't really believe in it, but they understood that it was necessary to hold up at least this outer framework if they do not want the Roman society to crumble entirely. And so that is why many conservatives also thought, well, it's not really a restitution as we would like it, but probably that is impossible, so that's at least the best we can get. So this feeling of uneasiness with conservative. And uneasiness, perhaps many people in Europe or the West may have with some conservative politicians also, where they look to thinking, okay, it's perhaps not bad what the guy says and wants to do, but in the end it's not the real thing, but it's better than nothing. That is, I think, what we are heading to. And that's what we see with every late civilization, that there is a phase of pseudo-conservative stabilization, which, if it is well done, can hold on for a couple or even more of centuries. Of course, this stabilization will present itself as renewal. Augustus also presented himself as the one who, at the end of the Iron Age, brings forth a new golden age and launches a new cycle of evolution and so forth. But nobody really believed in that, and it wasn't the case. Also, so there might be a rhetoric in 20 years of Europe, a renewal of Europe, we will start a new golden age and so forth, and it's perhaps also fine that people may perhaps believe that, but it will not be the true thing. There is no possibility of a true inner renewal and a new civilizational cycle for Europe. I'm the first one who hopes that he's not right, obviously, but I do not believe in that. And the history of compared civilization shows that something like that never happened. Civilizations are replaced by others who may blossom many decades or centuries later in similar or different places, but there is no cycle of civilization. Civilization civilizations arise and civilizations fall, and once they are fallen, then they remain down. They can perhaps give some inspirations to coming civilizations, exactly as classical antiquity inspired Western civilization, or like, for example, the traditional Chinese civilization inspired the later Buddhist Chinese civilization, and so forth. But in the end, there is no real possibility of a new beginning and a new golden age. And I think we have to realize that, and it may sound pessimist, but it doesn't change anything finally for us, because we have nevertheless to remain true to our civilization, because that is our duty. If we have someone who is dying in our family, once we know that this death is unavoidable, we don't drop in either. We know, okay, that's part of our life, and we have to make the best out of it. That is also our duty, I think, as European, and that is perhaps our dignity that becomes really obvious in it, and perhaps it is even one, you could say, one of the greatest duties and perhaps accomplishments of the Western civilization, that is to accept its end and nevertheless defend its value until the end. It's much more difficult to do that than to defend your values when you're in a phase of civilizational blossoming. So I think it's not the least task that history has given us, and I think we have to accept it and show ourselves true and comparable to what other people did in happier ages.
So I think it's time for the last question from the back, I suppose.
Mine was about the same question, so we can end there. We can talk.
Okay, so thank you for attending the event. Thank you, Mr. Engels, for your interesting presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Have a nice evening.